So, in our next section, we start to jump into talking about some of our brainstorming tools. And this is very, very critical when we start to think about, we've defined the problem now, and then our next step is how do we think about how we go solve it? All right. And we've all probably been there. We've been in some of those sessions where maybe you have a somewhat, brash or overbearing leader that, doesn't do the best job of fostering an open environment where people can say anything they want. And I've been in plenty of those where, maybe you make a suggestion. Well, maybe we should look at upgrading our software, and suddenly that leader jumps on you and says, no, that's not the problem. That's not the problem. Okay? How likely is that person going to be to speak up? Again. So one thing we like to start off with is when we start to brainstorm is thinking about some of the various tools that we use in that brainstorming section of analyzing and brainstorming the problem. So one of the most popular ones is we just like to look at a flow chart. And again, anytime a problem occurs, in my corporate days when we would try and dissect it, that was one of the first things we would do is we would take a look at the process. Okay, and it was always depicted in two ways: a actual graphical flow chart that had the different boxes that would show the way to go, and I've provided an example for you out there in Canvas of that, of a very simple flow chart that you've all seen. Some of you have probably created. Personally, I know the way I feel about creating a flow chart is I would rather get hit in the head repeatedly. I just do not enjoy mapping out processes. That said, I've worked with many people that very much enjoyed it and are very good at it, and I'm very grateful for them. So our simple flow chart, and you can pull up the example I've given you in Canvas, but we look at our inputs, we look at our process, and then we look at our outputs. Okay, so who provided the inputs? Was it a customer? Was it somebody on the inside, an employee, a salesperson, a marketing person, an engineer? Usually it's more than one person. Sometimes it's a combination of people and systems that are providing those inputs. What's the process that took place? And then what's the output? Now, one thing that all the material I've provided and several books I've read on this, I didn't require a textbook for this, 1 credit hour class because it seemed a little cumbersome. But where we historically fall short in this space is we have a problem. We do a good job of defining the problem. And then when we get into the brainstorming section, we look at the inputs and we get to the process. And then we realize we did not get the desired output or outcome, if you will. And a lot of times is what happens is we look and we go, well, we did have a process, okay? And we did not follow the process. We either didn't follow it at all or we didn't follow it properly, okay? And a lot of times where business leaders try and go with this is they immediately come in and say, well, there was a process, our people weren't following it, so that tells us that the people are not educated properly on how to follow the process. So everyone now has to complete a 2-hour training course on how to go do this. Okay. And I'll admit I was probably guilty of this early in my career as well, until a long time ago. In my career, I managed to hire an instructional designer. That was his forte. That was what he did. Was he looked at the learning process and how people learned and the motivation behind it. And we had a situation where something had went wrong, and me and several other leaders were going down this pathway of, okay, everyone's going to have to complete 2 hours of training to go over this again because they're not following the process. So in our heads, we associate this as you're too dumb and we need to train you on how to do this. Well, the truth is they had been trained. They knew how to do the process. They just chose not to. So this particular instructional designer that I had the opportunity of working with, and I'm going to have to call him and tell him I'm using his example here. We're going down this path, and he pulls me aside and he said, Dave, he said, the process is simple. It's well documented. And he said, people aren't following it. He goes, and you're telling me you're going to go train them again on this overly simplified process. And I said, yeah, that's the only alternative we had. He said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, if you held a gun to their head, and I don't think we can say that anymore in the public space, but if you held a gun to them and said, you have to follow this process, could they do it? And I didn't have to think about it even for a second. And I immediately responded with, well, of course they could. And he said, well, Dave, you're not dealing with an education problem. What you're dealing with is a motivation problem or an incentive problem. So that tells me that if their feet are held to the fire, they could follow the process. They simply choose not to. So what is it you do to motivate them to go do it? So I take this up the chain, and everyone says, well, you might be onto something. Instead of going the motivation route, what do? They go the punishment route. Okay, if you don't follow this process, you're going to get written up. That works. It doesn't always have the most favorable outcome. And the argument was, why should we reward people for doing the job they're supposed to do? Okay, so there's multiple ways you can slice that. But when we think about where the process fits in, okay, always ask yourself that. Could they do it? Okay, I wouldn't say if you held a gun to their head, that would probably get you in trouble. But I would say, if you chained them down to the desk and said, you've got to follow this process or you're fired, could they do it? And if the answer is yes, keep in mind you're likely not dealing with an education problem. You could be dealing with a motivation problem. The other thing I found is it could come down to time. I just simply didn't have the time to follow the process, and I didn't think it was a big deal. The process is too cumbersome. The process is maybe too clunky. Maybe the system isn't built, in an optimal fashion. I dissected one of these once, and the individual said, well, I know the process. I could do the process. He said, but the problem is, he went through and counted it. He said it takes 47 clicks in the system to follow that process. He said, and I have to follow this process over 50 times a day. He said, so 47 clicks times 50 times a day. He goes, this finger just can't do it. Okay. So if you take that seriously, you go back, right? So this is where we get into that and say, well, what could we do on our end to make this a little bit better? So looking at those flows, taking a hard look at that process and saying, first of all, does the process get it done? If it does, great. Does the process get it done in the most efficient and effective way? Okay. And if the answer is no, don't beat yourself up on that. Okay. Well, let me give you a great example. Oftentimes when we design something, be it software, any type of device, our first goal is just functional, right? And then over time, we hone that. Okay. Look at the first typewriter compared to the computer keyboard you use today. Okay. Very different. Okay. Look at the early versions of an office desk chair. Does anyone want to sit in those today? No. We've evolved those over time. But we would argue, did that first version of the typewriter work? Yes. Did that first version of the desk chair work? Yes. My back at 4 o'clock would likely disagree with that, but it worked. Okay. So important to note when you think about that, look at that process. Okay.